Welcome, friends of the Museum of South Texas History, to the April 2022 installment of Museum Pláticas. Today, the stories we'll be bringing to you are really stories that are both presentist and historical in nature. Today, we're going to talk about an exhibit that we have that was recently installed by our coordinator of exhibits, Melissa Peña. So I will be having a plática with Melissa when she comes on in just a few minutes. The exhibit that she has installed is called Bearing Witness, and we'll talk about what that means shortly. And so Melissa will come on in the next segment. The following segment after Melissa's, we will have two very, very special guests with us today. They are the Garay sisters, and so Araceli and Genie Garay have penned an article to eulogize, to commemorate, to celebrate their father as part of the Bearing Witness initiative. I would like to start today, however, this segment, the opening segment, by sharing some words with you from a diary that we have in our archives. And so the diary that we have is the diary of Emilia Junior Ramirez. Emilia Junior grew up here in Edinburgh. She was born in 1902, and in 1918, 1919, Emilia kept a diary. And in that diary, Emilia has words for us that are actually very special words because they are words from a journal entry in her diary where she spoke of the pandemic of 1918. So I would like to share Emilia's beautiful prose that sounds poetic. So she wrote, "Holidays often come to school children and teachers at untimely occasions as unbidden guests to a party. So they did once in 1918. Those were grim days, the days of 1918. They were brought about by the Spanish influenza. It, the calamity," she writes parenthetically, "filled everyone with terror. They, the holidays," she writes parenthetically, "were like summer without sunshine. But at last they came to an end in November. But then followed the Christmas holidays. They were not sad. They were like spring in spite of their wintry appearance." These are words from Emilia Junior, who was a high school kid at the time. And she wrote this in her diary that we have in our archives. How about that? It's just beautiful stuff that we have. When we come back, Melissa Peña will join me. My name is Francisco Guajardo, and I'm the CEO of the Museum of South Texas History, so stay with us. Thank you. Welcome back to Museum Pláticas, friends of the Museum of South Texas History, wherever you may be. You know, this thing of doing things virtually just opens the world to us in such a beautiful way. And we thank you for joining us today, this afternoon, as we are broadcast live, I think, through Facebook Live and also through our YouTube channel. So thank you for being with us. And so my guest today, a very special guest, is Melissa Peña. Melissa, how are you?
Hello. I'm doing good. I'm doing well.
So the reason you're here today, Melissa, is because you have developed and installed an exhibit that we're kind of calling like pop-up exhibits, right? On bearing witness. And so I would like to have a plática with you so that our community understands what it is that this bearing witness exhibit is about. So we're going to talk about that shortly. But first, if you would just tell the public what it is that you do at the museum and how long you've been here and, you know, that sort of thing. Introduce yourself.
Sure. I am the Exhibits and Collections Coordinator for the museum. I've been here for about, I want to say 6 years. I was an intern before that, but I've been here for about 6 years in one capacity or another.
And you're from where?
I'm from Edinburgh.
You're from Edinburgh.
Yes.
Okay. So it's interesting how people pronounce Edinburgh differently. You say Edinburgh, and I said Edinburgh. Why the difference?
I don't know, because you're not from Edinburgh.
Okay.
I can't make these excuses.
Okay, you're
for
from Elsa. You say Edinburgh, or what is that?
I don't know. You're not saying it right though, so that's on you.
I'm not
That's
saying
okay.
okay,
No.
Okay, whatever. So Melissa, bearing witness.
Yes.
So we were hit in March with this real calamity, just like Emilia called it a calamity in 1918, the Spanish influenza, the epidemic of that day. And so this thing just like hit us it came from out of nowhere, it seemed. And before we knew it, it descended upon our community, and we didn't know really, you know, how to make sense of it from a museum perspective.
Right.
You know, we began to search, what do we have that is a precedent for how to collect? And so then I think that, you know, somehow you, or I don't even remember who came up with the idea, it doesn't matter, but we did the idea, right? So tell us how this idea began to take shape, the idea of bearing witness.
So you're right. It started off with us looking to our archives to see what do we have on anything before that. And really that piece that you just read is all we had on a pandemic. And so we started collecting anything that was officially coming out of the state, the local government, anything they were putting out. And when you looked at it, it became cold. It didn't have faces to these names. It said male Edinburgh 53. And unless you knew specifically who that person was, it was just a number. And 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people are going to base their research on this pandemic. And we needed to present something different than the statistical documents coming out of the government. So I want to say we were in the kitchen probably talking, and we said we needed to humanize this. We needed to put a face to these numbers and make sure that the community understood that these were people that had families and lives.
So your reference to the kitchen is an interesting reference because, as you know, the way that a lot of creative moments happen is in dialogue, and oftentimes it's really around the coffee machine. And so early in the morning we come in and we sort of say hello to each other, and we're drinking coffee, and so I go and I set up my laptop there in the kitchen, and you come by, other people come by, and we may talk about, you know, whatever's going on that day. But during the pandemic, during the early days of the pandemic, when, you know, first we were out, I think, for maybe a couple weeks, and then we began to come in, but the coffee drinking continued, and then we were engaging in conversation. And so I think we found, you know, in each other a way to lean on each other to understand how to make sense, you know, of the day. And so somehow we came up with this idea. And so this is what I recall. I recall having a conversation with Pam, who is running this production here, so she's behind the scenes, about writing up stories. You know, the methodology of how to write them up, we hadn't come up with. I think you and I came up with that. But I think I had a conversation with Pam who said something about going to Stephen Wingard from the Monitor, you know, the publisher of the Monitor, the Valley Morning Star, and also the Brownsville Herald. And so I remember being maybe on a Teams call with Pam and called Stephen Wingard.
Of course, yeah.
And Stephen Wingard right there on the phone said, yes, he said, look, if you guys write something up, we'll publish it. We'll give you a weekly column.
Yeah.
And this is maybe about, I don't know, July, August of 2020, because we had just lost Sandra.
Yes. Yes.
And so Sandra, in many ways, was, I think, the catalyst, the motivation for us to really document her life, because nobody could go to her funeral.
Yes, and there wasn't that closure. And you'd walk through the front and think she was still going to be there. I was going to go take a coffee break with her, you know, and she wasn't there anymore. It was heartbreaking, and it was hard because we couldn't even go hug her family, who had been a huge part of this museum for so long. All of her kids were voluntold to do things here. Like they helped at all of our events, and then all of a sudden we can't even go say our goodbyes to them either. It was a really difficult time, and we were all afraid for ourselves after that happened. And yeah.
For 20 years, Sandra worked here.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so we thought, we need to write something on Sandra. And so when Stephen Wingard from the newspaper said, produce it, actually, he didn't say that. We volunteered. We said, we will do the research. We'll write it up. And he was very, very generous. And he said, yes, I will give you space. And so then Stephen sent Michael Rodriguez, the deputy editor of the newspaper, who then brought, you know, somebody else, you know, from the Harlingen paper, who would do, I guess, some of the design work, maybe the virtual stuff, or who was managing the virtual platform. And so we figured out a way that this is how we would do it. We would develop a series of stories, and we would send them to them. And so you and I would develop the stories. We would send them to Pam. Pam would send it to the newspaper, and then they would publish it. And we had to have them every week.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about how we went about the process of developing the stories.
So I had been following along a friend of mine on social media, which had at this point became like a lifeline, social media. You would go on to see how everybody else was doing because we were not meeting in person anymore. And so I was following a friend, Abel Garcia, who was a nurse and respiratory therapist in the respiratory area of the hospital. And I remember listening to or reading his things and just thinking his posts and thinking like, oh my gosh, heartbreaking, just so heartbreaking. And you'd have his post and then you'd have the county post with the statistics, and it just wasn't connected. So when we decided to do this, I said, I know the correct person, because Abel was following this along in the hospital, like he's working the hospital, but then his dad got it, and his dad couldn't stay down here. He went to San Antonio, and so now he is treating every single patient he had like his dad, in hopes and prayers that the people who were treating his dad were treating him that way too. And he would express these feelings, and it was just really hard to follow along, but you know, we all prayed and everything. And then when Abel's dad passed away, I knew that we needed to honor him in this way. He was just such a good man, and that was the first one that I texted.
So the very first article is really a lead article that Michael wrote. Michael Rodriguez wrote for the Monitor, and so that lead article then featured Sandra.
Yes.
But it's not one that we produced. It was kind of like, okay, we're about to do this. It was announcing to the public that we're about to begin a series. And so we told Michael that we wanted the series to be called the Bearing Witness series. Initiative. And so we call it Bearing Witness because the way we were to find the stories was by engaging with family members. And all of this we had to do through Zoom.
Yes.
Because it was during the time of the pandemic that people could not come together. So you were in one place, I was in another, and then we interviewed family members. So you would set up the Zoom call, or Pam set up the Zoom call, and then you and I would have a conversation with them. And so then you would also take notes, and then I would go and I would write it. And I would send it to you, and then you would say, this a little bit different, this is not what they said, and blah, 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 whatever. And so then I do a revision, I send it to you, and then you'd say, good, and I'd send it to Pam, and Pam would send it to the newspapers. And so we said, these people who bore witness to the life of, so we call it the Bearing Witness Initiative. That's how it happened. And we did this for 22 straight weeks, and it was 22 grueling and maybe the most emotional 22 weeks that I've ever experienced.
Absolutely. I cried for sure every single one. I feel like you may have too, but I cried with these families, and we would laugh. They would talk about quirky things that their family member did, and the stories, and they didn't do this, or they had, I don't know, they talked about coffee. There was always something that you could relate to. There was always something you could relate to, and it was hard, and it would take us a couple of days afterwards to not be in that.
Recover.
Yeah, to recover.
Yeah. And so, the writing, well, first of all, listening to the stories was very, very taxing. And then writing it was another emotional experience. And then getting over it, right? And then we just had like a few days before we went to the next one, because we needed to have one for the next week. And so the very first one that we did was Abel's father, Mr. Garcia. And then we did a second, and then we did a third. And then somewhere along the way, we reached out to people and asked certain people, would you be up to authoring one? And so the people we have coming up are Araceli and Genie, who actually wrote one to eulogize their father. Talk about how you did the whole presentation and installation of the exhibit.
So each story got its own panel. I printed a 2x7 panel, and I can't remember what it's called, but it was a certain type of, it's a printing on a fabric. And then I had my very handy husband build these amazing stands, because I really wanted it to be simple. I didn't want you to walk in and see the display. I wanted you to walk in and see the stories. And so they're tall. They're, I guess, like 9 feet tall. And it has the photo at the top and then that story underneath it. And it's just a minimalistic way of presenting it, because I felt like these people needed to be presented as the exhibit and not the exhibit being seen. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. You also, this did not require bells and whistles, and this required a level of, humility, simplicity, and just their stories. And I think that you did very good work with this, Melissa. And then you went and you placed benches so that if people wanted to go and just sit
and reflect. Yeah.
And so that was a very nice touch as well. And we've actually seen how people went and reflected. And so here you see the Cruz Huijon here.
Yes.
And so we had a few people who authored pieces, who volunteered to author pieces. So, we'll talk to Genie and Araceli, but there's a fellow here, who said, hey, can I do a piece on my uncle? So this is Jose Alanis, who's from Edinburgh, who's up in Seattle, Washington, and he wanted to, commemorate and, and eulogize his uncle Cruz. And he just happens to be a comic strip, artist, a cartoonist. And so that's what he did. And so that was very, very nicely done. And then we had one or two others also that were authored by other people.
Pete Torres
also did one on his friend.
Well,
yes.
Yeah.
And then also, and Dr. Eva Torres wrote one on a security guard from a school here in the Edinburgh School District. Yeah. And so that's Sandra's piece, the one that was the lead. Yeah. Well, Melissa, thank you very much for doing this. This is not just any, typical piece of work at a museum. This is work that on one hand archives forever. We're a museum, and that's what we do, right? We preserve and we present. But it was also a very personal thing. I mean, we are living in history, and so then how is it that we can step back a little bit, but document it and then present it, and in a way where it's tasteful, respectful, and the community can in some way interact with it, and hopefully it will help the community find a little bit of healing in the experience, and so thank you for doing that.
Oh, it was a privilege.
So when we come back, Melissa, I will be joined by the Garay sisters. So stay with us, friends of the Museum of South Texas History, and thank you for hanging in there with us. And when we come back, we'll have, I think, a spirited plática, because these two girls are very spirited, as much as they are reflective and thoughtful and smart. So look forward to the plática with Araceli and Genie coming up. Stay with us, please. Welcome back to Museum Pláticas, friends of the Museum of South Texas History. And so on this day in April, what is today?
28?
29.
Is
29?
it 29?
Sorry.
No,
It's
no
the
quiero que se
29.
peleen, eh?
It's a sister thing.
Trust her.
It's the 29th. So we gather here today, Genie and Araceli, and thank you very much for coming and spending some time with us to talk about, some of the most important, ideas and themes that we can imagine. We're here to talk about our families.
Right.
And so you heard the story that Melissa and I had through our plática previously about how this whole Bearing Witness initiative, kind of began, and then how it developed. And I don't know if you were following it at the very beginning, or what you were doing. I mean, everybody was like sort of like gripped by the pandemic
Right.
at the time, but you heard how it took off.
Yes. Yes.
I just wonder what your thoughts may be about, because you probably weren't privy to that, or at least not fully. Maybe I'd explain some of it.
Yeah.
So what, Genie, you first, what were you thinking as you were listening to it?
Right now?
Yeah,
or-
just now.
No, I agree about the humanizing the number was one big thing, that we would see the numbers, and then when we knew one of them was. The numbers felt cold. Sorry.
So, you know what I'd like to do is, I'd like to back up a little bit. Araceli, tell us who you are. Who are you? Where are you from? And maybe we can begin like this, and then kind of like warm into the stories.
Mucho gusto.
Yes.
Araceli Garay. I'm the big sister.
Thank you.
Mom, dad, whatever I need to be, whatever the big sister is, the big sister. I take care of my little sister and the brother in between, right? We're educators, and it's thanks to our dad, live in the Delta area, thrived in the Delta area, live in Elsa, but we went to school in La Villa because that's where my dad worked. That's where we met Ojado for the first time, which was one, big impact, going back to thinking about writing all of this. Even when I told him about college and all that, he would always be pushing UIL. You tell people, you come back and tell them why UIL is important. But when we were first told to condense something to like about 500 words, I'm like, oh, this is where UIL comes in, and putting thoughts, you asked us to talk about our family. We've got words for ages, we can go on and on about family, because family is everything to us. That's what we sort of teach my kids, that's what I teach my nieces and nephews, is family is everything. So when we're asked to talk about family, of course, of course, family is, we've worked all our lives to honor our family. So honor them in about, this much space. So let's get creative. Of course it can be done. We're not going to say no, but let's get creative. What needs to stand out? So been very blessed to work alongside my sister as a teacher at Run Elementary when we first started off, and then now in the district of Donna, but church, wherever we are, we're known to be very tight-knit.
So tell us who you are.
Genie Garay, Genevieve, and again, a lot of it was La Villa because that's where Dad was a teacher. He was the first high school teacher hired in La Villa, go figure. And so that's how come we went to school in La Villa instead of at Calchosa, where we are from, right? So I agree, writing was a big thing, largely because of, your brother. And I think when we got the task to write about Dad and condense, we kind of were, where do we begin? Which angle do we take? There's so much of him that we want to say and that we want to highlight and that we want people to know, again, the real person, not the person that was sick and that passed with COVID. So I think that took a lot of listing this, and then shooting back and forth, the ideas and themes, and catching the essence of Dad. Was because he was a storyteller, we felt we should be storytellers for him.
So what you reference about how do you condense it is really about the guidance that I provided to you,
Right.
which was broadly the guidance that the newspaper was giving us. And so the
Right.
newspaper said, keep it at about 500 words, more or less, although the newspaper was not going to be mad at us if we went to 550 or 600. In fact, there was one that we authored that was way over, and the newspaper didn't say anything about that. And so, but mostly we kept it somewhere between 500 and 600 words. So I don't remember how I found out about your father. If maybe, Araceli, I was in a conversation with you and you told me, or maybe I just saw it on Facebook, and then I reached out to you because I was looking for,
May have been face.
I don't want to write all of them
Right.
because it was hard, is one, but the other is that everybody's got a voice. and if people have the skill to be able to write it, then let's get people to write it themselves. So what's your memory of how it happened?
The whole writing.
How I
approached
went,
me.
yes.
I think you found out through social media. Because something that was very, through the pandemic, something we hadn't been able to do in April was celebrate my daughter's quinceañera, which we were able to do on June 20th. So there was a very epic moment of my dad dancing with her. You don't know what it's like to love somebody by the Bee Gees, right? And everyone just thought it was so beautiful, and he really looked forward to that. And I remember you mentioning, I saw the dance, right? And we were talking, maybe that's something that you could put on there. And he passed away a month after that quinceañera. So I remember you alluding to that. But yes, when you had mentioned it, well, it wasn't that much later. I was already back at work, so it must have been around August or September when I think that you were discussing that. But I was already, I would read the paper every day, and I was so tired when we were talking about humanizing and the numbers. The obituary section was like pages and pages long at the time. Pages, like nothing I've ever seen before. I take the time to pray for every soul. I read their name and I'll pray for them. That's something I do in the morning. But that was just overwhelming. And I remember that when my dad passed, it was so chaotic. And then I got sick with it at the time. And then the hurricane hit, so we couldn't even bury him in a timely manner. Not that we got to see him. But I just remember there was the funeral home said, we put out a death notice. And it was just like maybe 2 or 3 lines. And even with the whole funeral or the burial, should I say, we always felt, Dad deserved more, Dad deserved more. I remember actually, if I may, going to your mom's funeral and talking to your brother and saying that you all put your heads together and you were drafting and no, don't forget that. And I remember her obituary. Yeah. It was awesome. Beautiful. It was lengthy. It honored her. Mm-hmm. And I was like, 3 lines for Dad. So when this came, this opportunity came, yes, because my dad was more than what took him. My dad was so much more, and I wanted to take 500 words if I could. That's more than the 3 lines that were offered on the death notice, and put that together as well. So when I started seeing the bearing witness articles, it was perfect. They deserve that, and of course so much more, but at least that. And we were just so honored and grateful that the opportunity was provided for us to say, hey, yes, this happened to him, but let me tell you a little bit about him, because he deserves to have his story told as well.
So I remember when I spoke to you, and you didn't hesitate. You said yes, and I think you spoke for Genie also.
Oh, I always, big sister.
We think alike, though.
We think alike.
Probably
Okay.
see that right now.
And so then you went at it. Describe what happened in that process. Like, what were kind of the rules for the two of you? Did you meet physically? Were you in remote locations? Who wrote the first draft? Did you write this story and you wrote this story? Did somebody write what was the process to create?
We started with, like I mentioned, lists. It was hard to put the thoughts together. So just listing attributes, listing, cuentos, stories, things that, maybe some people knew, some people don't know, or that if they saw Dad in certain places, see, that was Garay, he would do that. So kind of trying to capture what we had of him, but we shared him with our community as well. So he was like a dad to others too. So we're trying to capture that, and then Sally went ahead and drafted because then I'm like, here, I'm real unorganized, I'm all over the place.
We have different writing approaches, but hers is to list all her ideas for herself.
Mm-hmm. So when she drafted, she's like, okay, here's the word count, and let's try to, okay, I can do this, and because you've read our writing, so I'm very verbose, and so that's my challenge, and still to try to capture. So then I'm like, yes, and here, let's add this right here. Like, for example, the blessing the town was Dad's thing. He would cruise and he would be blessing the town, saying his prayers, like for different parts of the town as well. and different houses in particular as well, and always with the church. Like we felt certain things were important because, you know, he'd be remembered for those things. Oh yeah, because I think Deacon eventually mentioned, yeah, your dad, we already knew his routine. He would come park at this point of the parking lot of the church, you know, say his prayers, saludar a la gente ahí, you know, and then keep going. So there was different things that others could recognize, and we kind of just shot it back and forth that way.
Mm. By the way, can you tell that story of cuando él bendecía partes del pueblo?
Yeah, he would. One was my grandmother's house because that's where he grew up, and now my brother lives.
This was on a drive
This was
that
his
were
nightly
routine.
Yeah.
We grew up on those nightly routines when we were kids. And I maybe he would do that para que nos cansaran and we can go to sleep when we'd go home. Y para que, según para bajar la cena after we'd eat, and then ya va, and he'd go cruising with his oldies or with, you know, Spanish music for sure. He'd like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, you know, then a bit, like we mentioned, I think Fernandez, Vicente Fernandez and Chente. Juan Gabriel was a big one, and he'd have us all singing, you know, and then like on the Hey Jude, the na na na, he had us count those. Like we'd go, so I want to look for rabbits, you know, and the dirt roads, like cuántos make a bet and how many cuántas liebres van a ver, you know, whoever would win would win a Dr. Pepper or a Coke or whatever. And those were nightly. We grew up with those. But as we got older, you know, everyone, you know, goes on their own paths, and he continued them sometimes with my mom, and sometimes she said, no, I want to stay home. And ya iba. And so he said, también les ayuda la policía. I can help them patrol. So if they would pull him over or anything, I'm helping you.
I'm on your side.
I'm
I'm
on
with
your
you
side.
guys.
so lo conocían por eso, because, you know, another neighbor had said, oh, I count on him doing those drives because I live by myself and I want him to, you know, watch for our house, you know. Y echaba bendiciones. His sister had passed the year before him. Choni también era conocida del pueblo. And so he would bless her house as well, you know, and then, of course, my grandmother's, and then, you know, which was his mother, which my brother now lives at, and then, you know, my other grandmother and just other friends. Yeah, he had his routine. Certain streets, as he got older, it just became certain streets. You know, that was his routine. When we were younger, of course, there were, you know, toda la villa, and eventually it was more just Elsa that he'd cruise, and he'd, you know, say his blessings, say his prayers. He had a list of over 200 faithful departed that he would know by memory.
Memorize.
So he prompted us, you know, to have our own. So, you know,
You
have
pray
our
for
list.
them every day,
absolutely.
every night.
Memorized by heart. And he's like, oh, I'll take my first.
So just of the drive, you just told that story in 700 words.
He was counting.
Yes,
But
tell you.
imagine that you wanted to say so much about your father, like the drives
Yeah.
and the radio being on and the
Concise.
ritualist. You had to condense that, and you wanted to say other things as well. So that was a Herculean task in discipline.
Right.
¿Cómo le hicieron?
We had good English teachers.
Very good writing teachers.
We really
Good
did
writing
know,
teachers.
and we'll attribute it to that, and to you know, for kids out there, join UIL, the writing events, because it really does help, you know, to be under that kind of pressure, you know, on the writing events. It's like you're given an hour or so. Give us, you know, something that's going to place quality, and give us, you know, as much information as you can, be concise. So just that. But ultimately, there's just, like you said, a world of things to say about our dad. You had actually suggested the quinceañera story with Esmer, with my daughter, right? And that's beautiful. We still see it, and it tugs in all the right places. But we thought we want to share him with everyone. What does everybody remember of him? Not everyone got to go to the quinceañera because it was right in the midst of COVID. I mean, there was like maybe if there were 30 people in the big old salon, that was a lot. So, you know, there were a couple of people that got to go, but everybody knew my dad in the way that we tried to portray him and narrow it down to in the article. We wanted to just get to, like she said, oh yeah, that's him. That's him.
A lot of intentionality around that.
Yes.
Tell me about the role that your mother or other people would have played in the creative process, if there was any role, or maybe not even just that, but also in the entirety of it, like from the beginning, from getting the phone call to the authorship of it, to then, you know, pressing send to send it to me. that sort of thing. And then even in el Inter, ¿verdad? Because presumably you prepped your mom for this. Like
Oh,
you
yes,
said, Mom,
yes.
there's going to be something in the newspaper.
She was
And
very
you-
excited about that,
Yeah.
by the way. Yeah.
And so talk about that process of how other family members would have been connected to that process of creating.
Well, with my mom, es, y no se les olvide decirles de,
No.
sí le encantaba el cruise, and she would just talk about that and about the prayer. But again, it was just so universal what he did, and then again, reading it to them. Genie's really good about translating word for word, so showing her exactly. And then with my brother, the same, and he's very, we're verbose, he's very solemn. That's good, Sally, that's good, that's good, yeah, that's dad, So that's just our core family right there.
And then it came out in the newspaper.
Yeah.
And so Genie, what was that like in terms of just, how you or the family would respond, would huddle together, would, I don't know, cut it out, or just like maybe, copy and share online, because you like did the story justice. I mean, not only in the authorship of it, but also in doing exactly what it meant to do, which was to have the community know about him. Because
Right.
this was not about COVID.
No.
This
Right,
was
right.
about Jose Luis Garay.
Right.
This,
Yeah.
yes.
I think because we didn't have the funeral, we just had a burial. We didn't have, we've done funeral rosaries since I was about 15 years old. For countless peoples, we do it with all our heart. But we couldn't do one for him. We couldn't have a service, and we wanted to honor him. So I think that was one thing that we saw. We always envisioned Dad's funeral as grandiose, y toda la gente, and it was very cold. We couldn't hug each other even and comfort each other. And my sister had COVID at the time, so she had to be apart from all of us. All of us were apart, sitting, the chairs were apart, everything. So my brother did ask me to say a few words. Usually Sally's the words person, and at the funeral, and just talking to some people that were sporadically there. But it was just, Dad deserved more, and he, deserved to be eulogized better. And so when we got the article, actually, first we saw it in the newspaper, right? Because we were at Hacienda, which we have our Sunday routine, and Dad was part of that.
Yeah.
So Mari Lozano was there, and she says, it's out, so también, we had seen that there. Oh, she actually showed us when everyone's was out, I think the last one. But the online one, we did.
Which, by the way, included
Her
Mari's sister.
Yeah, so she has one of these too, by the way. And so, and by the way, when we talk about that, that was the burial, the day that Dad was buried. I think her brother-in-law was being buried just a few yards away from Dad. So we I think kept that like in touch about that. But with the column on Bearing Witness, I remember we just shared it. We did share with Mom right away. That's when we saw, and shared it with our nieces and nephews, like forwarding it to everybody, that we could, and again, and with pride with some people, my dad was featured, we saw it, because I remember you said Dad would be, what, the third or fourth, maybe?
He was one of the early
Yeah,
ones.
yeah. So we were looking, and every Monday we'd read, and like earlier was mentioned, that your hearts go out to the family. Yes, because to understand what this was like, yes, like the sudden, goodbye, or that in many cases we didn't say goodbye, right? So I think we were waiting for Dad's, but again, we were finding the common thread with everybody's stories that were coming out. So as soon as we see Dad's, we wanted to share it with everybody, because we always envisioned Dad, being celebrated, in a bigger way. So I think that was what our aim was and why we shared. So we were grateful for the opportunity, to honor him, because we couldn't, on the July 22nd, no, 31st, on the burial.
There was a moment during, I think, the height of the first 6 months of the pandemic where it was a very hotly debated thing, the veracity of COVID, and so we got a note from the managing editor of the Monitor one day saying that the articles were having an impact, and he cited the plummeting numbers of naysayers writing to the Monitor, letters to the editor that were deniers.
Wow.
And so he said that what Bearing Witness was doing was it was putting faces and names and stories to people who were dying.
Absolutely.
And he said, and he was very proud of it because, you know, the newspapers were part of this. And so I thought that was such an important function, you know, that not only the newspaper was practicing what it saw as a social responsibility, but people like the two of you were, you know, honoring and celebrating your father, and whether you knew it or not, were also acting for the public good.
Yes. Yes.
And that happened.
Yeah.
That happened as well. It's like, you know, that was an impact that we did not have as a target. I mean, we had an agenda. The agenda was to honor people. That was our only agenda. I guess that we did have other things. We wanted to preserve and present. That's what we wanted to do. But there was nothing that was political about this from our perspective, because, you know, we don't want to be that. Yeah, we want to do the museum function. But as it turned out, there was this kind of collateral impact as well.
Right.
I wonder if the two of you ever reflected on something like that.
Hoped. And I think we saw that coldness. I know that when Dad had passed, I don't want to go in much detail, but we were pretty much asked, are you sure it was even COVID? It's probably not. Or, yeah, but he probably had underlying conditions anyway. And it felt so cold, you know, because yes, he was on dialysis, but he was managing very well. In fact, at the clinic, they would say that, oh, he's doing great, you know. So I think, and that would add to the shock, right? So I think adding the truth, you know, to it, because we heard the phone calls with Dad, you know, he was trying to keep positive. I was the last person he called, you know, and I could hear the what was it, the BiPAP that he had. But my brother had heard him. He called my brother first, and then he called me because they caught him on the phone. He had his cell phone. That was our only way to talk to him while he was there. So we made sure he had his cell phone, and so he was trying to sneak in calls. But my brother did hear him, you know, struggle to breathe. I heard the BiPAP, and my brother had already told me he's trying to take it off so that he can talk. So I did tell him, no, you're okay. Keep it on, you know, because we wanted him to breathe. So. And when we're asked, are you sure it was even COVID? You know, that hits us in a way that other people might not understand.
But you know what? I hadn't considered that it would have had that impact. But when you're saying that to me right now, I'm not really that surprised. And again, as I mentioned earlier, social media had become this lifeline with everybody. That's how, you know, we would find out what was going on. And even naysayers or people that could be pretty cold. When it was about Dad, he just had a way with people. He could soften anybody up, you know. In school, they'd give him the roughest and toughest kids. And those were the ones that were commenting. Such a great teacher. And you know, nothing negative.
Right.
Nothing negative was said. So when you're telling me that now, I'm like, well, that's Dad, you know. And people like him, you know. I would not, I'm not surprised by that, because these were good people. These were good people. Left behind, you know, left their families, and everyone had a chance to not glorify COVID, not, you know, give it unnecessary attention, but give it notice that, you know, something took them, but they were bigger than that. And I'll always say that about my dad. He was bigger than whatever took him from us.
Genie, what's the story on stories that must not die?
Well,
tell us the story of
people
this.
in Lavia will see this. If they were Dad's students, they see this book and they say, think Mr. Garay. Or they think Mr. Garay and they'll think stories that must not die, you know? So we grew up on these stories, a lot of cuentos. Dad was a big time storyteller, and we'd like to think, you know, first with us. So because he grew up on those cuentos as well. So, you know, we'd huddle together and he would tell us the stories, and he would, you know, his intonation and his, you know, rising and falling of the voice was just perfect. He'd pick it exactly for the feeling he was trying to capture and portray and evoke in us, right? Espantarnos, you know? So he loved that. And then he loved us to just be so engaged. And he would tell us all these stories. And then as a teacher, you know, he would tell them as well. And one day he found them in the La Villa library in our school. So he called, come here, it's here. And John Savageau wrote a lot of these stories. And so we say there's still a couple of them missing because we know a couple of them by heart as well. But he would use them in his class, you know, to capture and make connections with his, you know, students as well, because a lot of us grew up with these oral stories. So this is something, you know, that when I gave him the book, he was excited. He thought it was part of my course workbooks, and because he was receiving the mail there, and it was actually his gift. So we have a picture with he's, you know, smiling after getting the surprise, and that's what we actually, you know, put on our little medals from Yellow Heart Memorial as well.
So one last story is the experience of you coming to the museum when you found out that Melissa and the museum had, you know, prepared and installed this exhibit on buried witness. So I wonder if you can just take us through, you know, the experience that you had, however that may have been, like, you know, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, you know, cultural.
It's all those things because we came on Good Friday. We came, we did the Stations of the Cross at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then I picked up my brother's kids, but we had talked about it, and I had said, there's an exhibit, and you had said you wanted to come earlier, but
I thought it was an event because I saw it was on April 12th initially, and that's when, I guess we were missing the event because it was her birthday. And so I was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't, you know, yet. And then she said, no, it's going to be there. Oh, vamos. We need to go. Hey, todos vénganse.
that's when we knew we were going to have all the
Yeah.
kiddos, my kids and my brother's kids and
And
my
Mom.
mom. And we didn't tell the kids. You told Mom, right? That what you know, the kids we really didn't. And they were like, hey, we've come to this museum before.
So there's an image there, Araceli,
Oh.
that's you up front.
Yes.
There's Dad.
Yeah. When as soon as they come in and they were saying we've been here before, and all of a sudden they're like, "Huelo, that's Huelo."
Ah.
Yeah, they
Okay,
were so
so-
happy with
So
that.
so narrate this. So Araceli, who is to your right? And
That's my boy. That's my son Miguel, and right behind him, or like in between us, if you see, that's my mom.
okay, but there's somebody up front,
That's-
right on
that-
your shoulder.
Crystal.
Oh, that's Crystal. That's my niece Crystal. She's the baby of the family, 14 years old. The other girl, which is my daughter, is to my left. That's Esmer. She's doing half a heart. Her and Crystal kind of joined their hearts, right? And there's my sister Genie, and then we have Jesus, and I don't see Christian in there somewhere. He's gotta be there.
Did he sneak off?
Well, you're taking this picture, right? This is a selfie.
Yes,
Selfie
yes,
stick,
with a
yeah.
selfie stick.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, with
To
the
get
selfie
it's the
stick.
best way to get everyone in there.
Yeah.
And
then-
Dad, I had
And
to
then
put
your
him on
father,
there.
yes. And so, yeah, no, that was very nicely done. And we just pulled this from Facebook.
Of course, that's why it's there.
And
I
so-
wanted to share Dad with everybody.
Yes, yeah. And so the title, I thought it was a nice title. Beloved storyteller and teacher, remembered for storied life. By the way, the monitor, I think, came up with all the
Little captions.
the headlines.
Yeah.
I think, Pam, maybe you can correct me on that. Yes, and that's a thing, right? Like,
That was perfect.
Well, that's exactly what we wanted
That's
to say
perfect.
about him. So
Yes.
kudos to whoever did that.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
and actually, when I posted it on Facebook, that's what I quoted exactly.
Mm.
I quoted that headline right there: "Beloved storyteller and teacher," and how sweet and fitting that is.
Yeah. Wow.
And Maestro.
So that was very nicely done. And so, how about you, Genie? Your reflection on coming to the museum and seeing this and experiencing this?
Yeah, we did also talk to the kids because there were a few faces that we also recognized. You know, like I did mention Mr. Hernandez. You know, he was one of our teachers at La Villa. I remember I was in 4th grade in Mrs. Fryer's class. He was right next door. We'd see him, you know, every day. So then we didn't know, honestly, that he had passed and in the way that happened until we read. You know, I wouldn't have known. So again, talking to the kids about this and then talking to Mom about this. But I think like the writing for us also like is a catharsis, and I think it's a way to honor, but also like I think it's a collective healing because of a collective grief that we have, right? So I think it was just beautiful, and the way that it was explained earlier, we were listening in the back getting choked up, but standing tall, that was great. We love that. Yes, like standing tall, standing proud.
And where the person is actually the feature.
Yeah.
You know, that is beautiful.
Did
Yeah.
when we talked about that, was that on air or before we began the
Oh,
program?
It was on air.
When I said to Melissa I wanted to bring the thing in, or
Oh,
that was a conversation before, I think.
Right.
But Melissa did talk about
Yes.
the tallness of it. Yeah.
right. That's what she was explaining. And we're like, yeah, so much thought behind it
Yeah.
makes it even.
Yeah.
wow.
She's pretty good. Melissa is pretty good at
Yeah.
at representing.
Yes.
But your father was pretty good too.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Genie, thank you so much for making time to come and just tell stories, with our friends of the museum and Araceli, thank you so much also. And both of you lovely, lovely young women.
It's an honor.
Thank
This
you
was
so
an
much
honor.
for-
Thank you
for
so
being
much
Thank you
part of
for
this.
for
opportunity
giving
as
us a
well.
voice and giving my dad a voice.
Giving Dad a chance. Yes.
Thank you.
So, on that note, thank you to Friends of the Museum of South Texas History for being part of this experience of Museum Pláticas. This is our April segment, and so we will see you next month in May of 2020 for the next Museum Pláticas. Thank you so much.